Don't laugh. When I was watching you watch the screen, it looked as if you had all seen a miracle. In any case, when I was asked to do this, I decided to plagiarize. So I went to a book written in the mid-1990s by a person with my name, and I took chapter 7, and I figured, what the heck? It deals with Ukrainian state building in the context of the revolutions that were taking place in the Russian context in 1917, 1921. We speak, this is a conference dedicated to Ukraine, rightly so, but we forget, how easily we forget, that in the period between 1917 and 1921, virtually every nationality of the Russian Empire, every big and important, politically important nationality within the Russian Empire, declared and or strove for and or achieved and or ultimately lost independence, starting with the Finns, moving down through the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, well, Bessarabians, call them that. Then the Armenians, the Georgians, the Muslims of Azerbaijan, the Muslims of the Kazakh-Kyrgyz steppes, the Muslims of the Khiva, of Bukhara, the Crimean Tatars, the Volga Tatars, and many others as well. All of them attempted to achieve independence. Some of them succeeded, some of them failed miserably, some of them failed not too miserably. In other words, there were roughly 3 categories of independence movements. This particular essay and the comments that I make, that we'll be making, and they're going to be short, I promise, to you, rests on a very simple insight, namely that in the national liberation struggles attempt to create states within the context of existing state formations, they are the underdogs by definition, right? They don't have state institutions, they generally don't have militaries, they don't have transportation networks, they have underdeveloped elites, and so on and so forth. The catch-all term for all those things is resources. They don't have the resources that states do, and so it's not surprising, historically and comparatively, if you look at national liberation struggles, they rarely, if ever, succeed on their own. What they usually require in order to succeed is either external assistance, someone comes in and provides them with arms, with assistance of various kinds, or alternatively, something needs to happen to the enemy state, to the opponent state, namely something that would weaken it and deprive it of its resources, and a nice term for that something is war. So when wars happen, national liberation struggles often emerge, and it's under those circumstances that they often, not always, but sometimes often succeed. Anyway, that's the general framework. There's much more to it in this chapter that I'm plagiarizing, but if you're interested, you can look at that. In any case, if you look at these movements that emerged between 1917 and 1919 and then struggled to survive in one fashion or other, you find that they fall into 3 rough categories. And mind you, nothing is perfect, so please bear with me. But nevertheless, there are 3 categories. Category number 1, those are the countries that achieved independence and sustained and remained independent through 1939, namely Finland, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. I include Bessarabia, but that's a special case because it became part of Romania. So I'm not really going to talk about that. Category number 2, countries that acquired independence from roughly 1 to 4 years, which is to say a little bit, but not too much. All right? And that's the Bukhara, Khiva, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine. And then category number 3, minimal, if indeed any particular independent statehood, which is to say roughly for less than a year. That was Belarus, the Crimea, by that I mean the Crimean Tatars, Bashkiria, the Volga Tatar region, and the Kazakh-Kyrgyz steppe region as well. So you have 3 categories of countries, and if you look at these countries, I mean, again, these regions rather, I won't call them countries, I'll just call them regions, you see that they're really very diverse. They're all over the place. There's nothing nothing that any one group has in common that would explain its success or its obvious success. I mean, the one thing that the Finns, Poles, Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians do have in common is that they had high literacy rates. Okay, and that's why they became independent? That doesn't make sense, all right? Anyway, I go through a long list of categories in order to explain these groupings. And again, I won't go into the logic, I'll simply mention what these categories were, the degree of self-rule they enjoyed in the Russian Empire, the degree of national consciousness, nationalism, the presence or absence of urban populations, those are considered to be important in generating national liberation struggles, the presence or absence of local Bolshevik forces, the size or competence of native armed forces, the presence or absence of national elites, elite effectiveness, and so on and so on and so forth. And if you look at these categories and you try to correlate them with these three groups, you find that they don't work. I mean, there's nothing that really accounts for these three divisions, at least nothing that I've listed thus far. So, surprise, surprise. What does account for these three groups? And the argument I'm making is that it has to do with the ebb and flow, quote, and here I'm quoting myself, the ebb and flow of the various forms of conflicts and interventions taking place in 1917, 1921. So that is to say, the location of the World War, the location of the Civil War, and the extent of external support. In other words, essentially international or external factors. And then I'll just provide you with my conclusions here, which pretty much summarize what this is all about, and then I'll talk more about some of these points. So, with regard to the first category, okay, Finland, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bessarabia. Irrespective of their own resources, these countries remained longest outside the Russian-Soviet orbit, and that's simply because they happened to be away from the Civil War. The war was in the south and in the east, okay? They largely escaped the Civil War. They enjoyed substantial external assistance, and by that I mean the Germans. The Germans engaged in a kind of nation-building effort in Poland, Finland, as well as in the Baltic German region. And they therefore succeeded in acquiring independence. Now again, the anomaly, and this is the point that, again, we sort of expect the Poles and the Finns to be successful. They were big, they were autonomous, they've been troublemakers for many years, so they should have been able to acquire independence. The Estonians, the Latvians, and the Lithuanians, 500,000 people here, a couple of 100,000 people here, 2-3 million in Lithuania. That just doesn't make any sense. And the only reason they acquired independence was simply because the Bolsheviks were distracted by events in the south. Anyway, the second category of countries, I mentioned those to you, Bukhara, Khiva, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. These are the countries that briefly escaped Russian and or Soviet control. They received little or no external support, and were therefore forced to rely on their own underdeveloped resources, and they therefore succeeded in attaining independence only temporarily. They were, as it were, they had some advantages, but not quite of the first category, and they had more advantages than the third category countries, but significantly less than the first category. And then you've got the third category countries or regions, Belarus, Crimea, Bashkiria, the Bulgar Tatars, the Kazakh Kyrgyz region. They bore the brunt of the Civil War, received no foreign aid, and had very few or any of their own internal resources. Anyways, what's the upshot of all this? One is, the first conclusion is, don't blame the Ukrainians, all right? I mean, yes, you can blame the Ukrainians, and I know if you go into the historical details, there are lots of things you can blame the Ukrainians for doing badly, incorrectly, and so on and so forth. Absolutely, that goes without saying, and I'll grant you that. That said, my hypothesis, my argument is that they were probably going to lose regardless of who would have been in charge. Take your 10 best Swiss bankers, your 10 best German politicians, place them in charge of the Ukrainian government in 1917, I would bet to you that they would still have lost. All right? It wasn't in the cards. I mean, the geopolitics were simply all wrong. All right? Given the existence of the Bolsheviks and the Whites and the Civil War and the Germans and the Austrians and the Poles and everything else, Ukraine happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, quite simply. All right? And in that sense, I commiserate, I sympathize, I fully understand the criticism that is directed at the Ukrainians, the directors, the UNR, and everybody else. That said, my suspicion is that there's very little that they could have done. By the same token, and again, the counterexample is the Estonians and the Latvians. I mean, there's no way in hell that they should have acquired independence, and yet they did. And they happened to be at the right place at the right time, in contrast to Ukraine, which was in the wrong place in the wrong time. In other words, these international geopolitical factors play an extremely important role. I'm not sure if they're decisive. Let me go and say they're decisive, just to provoke a debate, which is to say, if you don't have them, it's not going to work. If you have them, you may still not succeed, but you're likely to succeed. Some conclusions from this. So conclusion number one, as I said, don't be so hard on the Ukrainians in 1917, 1921. They did a pretty good job in an utterly miserable set of circumstances. Conclusion number two, it's not surprising that the efforts at independence in 1941, regardless of what you think of them, failed. Where you have a major titanic struggle between two superpowers, you're not going to build a state. It's just not going to work. You can't build a state on ruins, right? You can build a state if the enemy state is in ruins, but not if you are in ruins. And then my final conclusion relates to today. It's not surprising to me that in 1991, Ukraine was able to acquire independence and has been able to sustain its independence, and I predict will continue to maintain its independence precisely because the geopolitics are pretty good. Russia is a big country, but it's essentially a paper tiger, right? Has a big army, but you know, the economy is cloddish, the president is a brute. I fear Russia, but I don't fear her too much. And at the same time, Ukraine does have the support, active and or tacit, positive and or neutral, of a significant portion of the international community, of the Europeans, of the Americans, even of the Americans. Which leads me to think that the geopolitics, the international circumstances for Ukraine's continued independence are pretty good. So, you may want to blame the government in Ukraine today for not doing enough, but at least they've been sufficiently competent to maintain the existing geopolitical circumstances that are likely to lead to Ukraine's being here 100 years from now when we celebrate the revolution of 2014.